Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. We have been joining Angie McCartney and her adventures taken from her book, My Long and Winding Road, and it sure is an appropriate title. She has done a lot. In the last episode, things started happily for her, but then came the time when people seemed to be passing away all at once. Once her husband died, Angie made a bad business deal, and it left her and her daughter going from place to place, trying to find stability. Let's see what she's up to today. Angie remembers seeing a UFO. She said in the early 80s she was driving back home in Kingsland in the middle of the night after a gig. She was on a lonely road near Royal Sandringham when she saw something that chilled her to the bone. It was a dome-shaped object with a series of lights showing from below it. Angie pulled the car over and turned off the car engine and the lights and made sure her doors were locked and sat there scared. She wasn't sure how much time had gone by when it stopped hovering, and it took off with a swooshing sound, going back up in the direction it came down in. After she got a hold of herself, she turned on the car and drove home. She entered her home and sat up all night with the lights on. Angie said, "Say what you will, but there's no doubt in my mind there's other intelligent life out there." Now she talks about Gary Glitter. Angie thought long and hard about whether to mention Gary now that things had come out over his deficits in character. Angie said he was an odd duck when she knew him, and she said there was something off about him. Angie was his co-manager back in the 70s when he still had sparkle. Glitter, along with T-Rex, Slade, and Sweet, were part of the glam movement that sprung up in the United Kingdom in the early part of that decade. The entertainers were campy and wore androgynous clothes, makeup, and hairstyles. Glitter said he was one of the most outrageous and pushed the limits by wearing a bad wig. One night in Edinburgh, Gary's wig flew off and went surfing into the audience. A roadie tossed a bottle of Coca-Cola into the three-phase power system and caused a blackout until the wig was found and put back on Gary's head. Gary Glitter had an elaborate stage gear which was part of his act. After the shows, they would take his clothes back to the hotel and dry out the sweat with a hairdryer. That part sounded kind of gross. And Gary had one white sequin tailcoat, and it started to wear out. So Ruth took it to pieces and made a paper pattern and created a new one. This project took over the entire space of their apartment on the Royal Sandringham estate, and she sewed it together on a small Singer sewing machine. Gary hired a very talented musician, but he didn't look as good as he sounded, so he had to play his instrument offstage behind a curtain. He wasn't glam enough to be seen. The groupie scene was alive and well in those days. They would work their way from the truck drivers to the roadies to the drum roadies to the band with hopes of getting to Glitter. She said if only they knew. Glitter's head roadie would find talent after the show for the backstage visitations. Angie said she would pick out the younger ones and put them in taxis to keep them from a fate that might have been worse than death. She said back then we didn't know the full extent of his tendencies. Angie said he was a ham who would end each concert with the song "Remember Me This Way," and he would always sign off with "I love you" and then name the city. Angie said she got along with the roadies and the backing musicians. They were a rowdy and playful bunch, and they would superglue the keyboard keys down or the piano player's glasses to the top of the piano. Angie said that was long ago and far away, but Glitter remained the same, if not weirder. She remembered watching television and seeing a story about him finishing a period of incarceration in Thailand for activities with underage girls. Glitter wasn't comfortable to be found out. Angie said that despite all that came out about him, there was still a number of Gary Glitter Appreciation Facebook pages out there. She said some girls will never learn. Angie and Ruth moved to Sydney in early 1983. They wanted better weather and a better chance. They had close friends named the Crawfords who took them in and gave them a home. It took them 52 hours to get there because of horrendous stopovers. They were so broke, and they welcomed each new flight to see what they might have to eat on board. And when they finally landed, they were jet-lagged and in need of a shower and starving. They were met by the Crawfords and their friends, and when they got to their beautiful home in North Curl, they had a surprise party for them. Angie said that her and Ruth looked homeless and smelt bad, but all went well. They had built a special extra room on the back of the house for them, combined with a bar. Angie said then the rain came, the worst that they had seen in 60 years. The downpour managed to find the snags in the newly built extension, and it started to pour in. Rory and Bill came to the rescue with stepladders, buckets, sheets of plastic, and anything to plug holes or catch water. Angie and Ruth were so worn out by this point they could only laugh and cry at the same time. Soon, though, they had a great night's sleep and the sun was out and a new day began. Angie said the whole family had long been involved with the Sydney Opera House, from the box office to lighting to staging, etc. And Rory would fly for a Qantas, so when Angie and Ruth went to Los Angeles, he would stop over there. Angie and Ruth made a few trips to Australia over the years. She said it was an incredible country where nobody takes themselves too seriously, and they work to live, not live to work. She said if she wins the lottery, she might finish up in Sydney. When they left Australia, they went to Southern California. They loved the warm sunshine, and they were deciding what to do with the rest of their lives. They got temp jobs, and Angie used her secretarial skills, and Ruth went into commercial production business. Angie and Ruth knew Beryl Kendall, and she was the wife of Tom, who was Aunt Millie's son. Tom was a seismologist, and they traveled the world to many remote places. At the time, she was living in Orange County, and she insisted that Angie and Ruth stay with her while they figured out the next move in their lives. She said Lynn and her husband Van Lyme picked them up in Los Angeles airport, and they were bewildered by the traffic. She said they had never seen anything like the multiple lanes of traffic on the California freeways. Angie said they lived on their savings and the money they made from their Newtown photo job in Australia. They had $2,900 in total and spent $2,100 for an orange VW Bug, so they only had $800 left. They didn't have work permits, no prospects, but plenty of optimism. She said at that stage they didn't know that they would be there so long, and proudly became U.S. citizens there further down the line. While they lived with Beryl, one day Angie was taking a shower when the bottom of the bathtub suddenly opened up beneath her. She joked she didn't know she was that heavy, and gallons of water poured into the living room. It was a panic, so Ruth switched off the water main, and they called a local disaster recovery firm to fix it. Angie said she was mortified, but later in the day they were laughing thanks to a bottle of Bacardi. It took months for Beryl to get it sorted out with her insurance and the homeowners association. Angie said, bless her, she didn't hold it against her. Beryl loaned them her car to drive up to Hollywood to meet folks that their Australian contacts had suggested they contact. That led to a series of events. Ruth would have a first marriage to Paul Antonelli, and they relocated to Hollywood, got green cards, citizenship, etc. Beryl passed away June 16, 2012, after a 4-year battle with cancer. She was cared for by her kids, Tim and Debbie, until the end. She was a wonderful woman, a dear friend, and an inspiration to us all, Angie stated. Then Angie brought up the story about she came up with the idea of Murder, She Wrote. In the early days in Los Angeles, Angie and Ruth became friendly with a writer, actress, voiceover lady named Carol Baxter. One Thanksgiving, when Angie and Ruth were over, they started to talk about plots, stories, and anecdotes. Angie told her about a friend of her mom's. She was a psychic, and when riding her bicycle around Freshfield on the outskirts of Liverpool, she sometimes would hear a phone ring in a telephone box. She would go over, pick it up, the phone, and receive messages from her long-deceased husband, and he would tell her things that were going on in the village. Mabel thought she was an amateur sleuth and would get into the local affairs, worrying the police about it with her theories. And she would hear the voices and have visitations and apparitions guiding her to solve crimes. Carol and Angie thought it would be a good outline for a TV series. With Carol's help, Angie created a document laying down her ideas on paper, and then she sent it in regular mail to New York home address of Angela Lansbury. Angie, she said, was working for RKO Home Video at the time, and they had worked on a production of Sweeney Todd with Miss Lansbury. One of Angie's colleagues knew where Lansbury was living. Angie sent it off to her and never heard anything more about it. When Angie mailed it, she said she didn't certify the mail and didn't put on a return address, and she wondered if she had ever received it. Probably not, she thought. Months later, Angie read in the Hollywood Reporter that a TV series was in the works about a lady writer who sleuthed out suspicious activities. Angie felt it resembled her story. So she called the Writers Guild. Angie told them that she wasn't a member, but asked for their advice. And they had her send them a copy of her outline and got back to her. They said while there were similarities, there were not enough for them to take it up on her behalf. It would cost Angie a fee, and that was out of her league, so she dropped it. Whenever Angie would see publicity on Murder, She Wrote, Angie would always mutter under her breath, "Murder, I wrote." She said, "Note to self, register all concepts with the Writers Guild Association." Then Angie starts to speak about Dudley Moore. She said that Ruth dated Dudley Moore during a period when he was between wives, and their British sense of humor gave them a bond. He had a house on Venice Beach, and he was partners with Tony Bill at a nearby restaurant, 72 Market Street. It closed its doors a few months before Dudley passed away. They had lovely evenings around the piano at his house and would finish the evening sharing English ditties and jokes and laughter. Angie could never get over that this lovely man, who was a huge movie star, could be their friend. He would sometimes call them on a Saturday afternoon when he was lonely, and they would reminisce about the old days growing up in England, which hadn't been easy for any of them. Angie would tell Dudley jokes her father used to tell, and he thought they were hilarious. Angie thought they were chestnuts, but there was always someone who hadn't heard them before. Angie said her and Ruth were followers of his career, starting with not only but with Peter Cook on British TV. Then Dudley became a movie star with hits like Bedazzled, Foul Play, 10, and Arthur. Dudley had musical talent too and made a great album with Cleo Lane and John Dankworth called Smiling Through. Angie still has the album, along with many others that she's carried with her on her travels around the world. Dudley was touched when Ruth told him that he was the reason that they originally came to the United States. They were down on their luck, living in London, working several jobs each. One Sunday afternoon, they got enough money together to see the movie Arthur, and it changed their lives. Ruth formed the idea that one day we would live in America. Some years back, when Ruth was asking celebrities for recipes for a charity cookbook, he sent her one. Angie said nothing could replace happy memories of times with gentle people like Dudley. He died on March 27, 2002. The official cause of death was pneumonia, but in truth he had been battling progressive supranuclear palsy for many years. He was cared for by his dear friend, fellow pianist Rena Frutchter, and her husband. The palsy made him appear drunk at times. The disease is similar to Parkinson's. Dudley was honored by the Queen as a commander of the British Empire and attended the ceremony at Buckingham Palace in a wheelchair. He was frail but determined to turn up to accept this award that meant so much to him. Angie said that Dudley, with or without the Queen's blessing, was royalty in her book. Then in the mid-1980s, Angie was asked if she would like to interview for a job as a personal assistant to the famed actress Bette Davis. Angie was happy with her job, and she recommended her dear friend Laura Colvard. Laura was interested, and when she was interviewed, she was hired right away. Laura got herself a new wardrobe and was expecting a lot of perks, comfortable quarters of her own in Miss Davis's West Hollywood home, and various benefits. It didn't turn out that way. Laura was told to address her as Miss Davis, and she was the type to fly off the handle regularly. She insisted on sitting down to formal dinner early in the evening. Her housekeeper lived her life like she was walking on broken glass. She had to tiptoe around her, as other members of the staff did, and they had to remain silent when serving dinner. Laura realized the job wasn't going to be easy when one of the wrong water glasses were set on the dining table. Bette Davis picked it up and threw it at the poor housekeeper, yelling, "These are not the right water glasses." So Angie was dying to hear from Laura about how things were going, and she got a call from Laura, who phoned her from a payphone at a nearby Ralph's supermarket, because she wasn't allowed to make personal calls from the residents. Miss Davis would make Laura get up after she'd already gone to bed to sit up and smoke cigarettes with her and talk. Laura ended up quitting and returned to her private life in the nice apartment that she had luckily kept. Angie said that Laura now lives in the Nashville area, and they talk all the time and reminisce about their time in wicked Hollywood. Now, Angie briefly talks about Ozzy Osbourne. Angie said that her good buddy, Laura Clavert, worked for Don Arden of Jet Records in Hollywood Hills. Don was the father of Sharon Osbourne, and Sharon became Ozzy's manager with great success. Laura introduced Ruth to Paul Antonelli of Animotion, and he became the husband number one. In their union, she became a green card holder, then a citizen, and enabled Angie to do the same. Laura brought Ruth in as a temporary assistant, working on a variety of projects. And she was in the office the fateful day that Ozzy was said to have bitten the head off a dove at the record label's offices. She was only aware of this when all the lights on the switchboard lit up with calls from frantic radio and TV station journalists. She said the story has had so many versions of it that it would be crass of her to disillusion the reader with the real truth. Next up, Ruth killed Orson Welles. So Angie said when she was working at Penthouse magazine in Westwood, her boss, Wendy Bloxham, would occasionally treat her to a meal, a perk for some of the extra hours that she would put in. On one of these times, Angie used the boss's credit card to take her and Ruth out to dinner. It was October 9th, 1985, to celebrate what would have been John Lennon's birthday. They went to the swanky Mason in Hollywood. It had trellises, ivy, French provincial style of cafe tables, and little white lights in the trees. The restaurant had closed a few months after this incident. They sat down and they got their pre-dinner drinks. Then they saw Orson coming through the kitchen area. The waiter told them he was more comfortable getting in by the back doors, which were wider. He was seated in a far corner of the bar, and Ruth made eye contact with him. Ruth raised her glass and muttered some complimentary remarks about her admiration for his work, etc. She offered to buy him a drink. He at first declined, stating that it was doctor's orders, and settled for a mineral water. But Ruth was persuasive and said to him, "It would be such an honor to buy you a drink. One little martini isn't going to kill you." Mr. Welles politely accepted, and the waiter gave him one. He lifted his glass, and we all toasted one another across the room. Angie said, "Imagine our horror when early next morning they heard on the radio that Orson Welles had passed away in his sleep that night. He had just appeared on the Merv Griffin show on TV and wasn't feeling well. His excessive weight was a serious problem. They saw how labored his breathing was, but it was wonderful to remember that he was the perfect gentleman in the way he acknowledged them." Angie said her favorite movie was Citizen Kane. So I will end the video here. Angie and Ruth sure have led eventful lives. I can't believe how many places they lived, and then going to Australia and to California. They always seemed to land on their feet somehow and managed to meet some famous people along the way. Angie encountered a UFO that must have been terrifying. I probably wouldn't have been able to sleep that night either. And what nice friends they have, the Crawfords, who built an extra room of their house for Angie and Ruth to live in while they were trying to get back on their feet. They had friends in California, and they got to stay with her until they got jobs and a place to stay. They also were friends with Dudley Moore, and it was nice to see they shared the stories of England with fondness, even though their beginnings weren't that great. And Dudley seemed like a kind man. Poor Orson Welles, I don't think Ruth's insistence for him to have an alcoholic drink killed him. He was having health issues because of his weight. Bette Davis sounded like she would have been hard to live with. She had to be in charge, and she bossed everyone around without having a sense of fun. I love her acting, though. Next time Angie meets even more famous people, and we may be coming to the end of her story in the next video. I hope everyone's been enjoying the videos, and if you have, if you would give it a thumbs up, it would help me to gain even more viewers. And I appreciate all the viewers who like watching my videos. It means a lot to me. Tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever, and I wish everybody a great day. Thank you. Bye.